Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 76 of SCOTONOMICS. We're going to be discussing this fantastic new book, When Nothing Works, with Professor Julie Froud. But before that, I'd firstly like to welcome my co-host onto the screen. Here is Karen van Sweden. Hello. Karen. How are you doing?
Nice to be back.
Well, welcome to you and welcome to everyone who's watching us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and also, not LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and also on Twitter. Karen, busy week so far. What have you been up to so far this week?
So we had a really busy week at the council last week, lots of big committees right at the end of the week. So yes, hopefully we are going to have cycling and infrastructure coming to the centre of Aberdeen. So that's really exciting. The other thing that's really topical just now, William, in the UK is the decriminalisation of drugs, which the Scottish Government are pushing forward. It's really topical right now. And the drug industry seems to account for around 1% of global trade, and that is estimated in 2014 as somewhere between $426 to $652 billion. It's a huge industry. Now, we've ostensibly got our next guest on, Josh, to talk about an article, a great article he wrote in The Independent, but this is actually something that he's very interested in as well. So maybe we get some thoughts from him on this too. Hi, Josh. Welcome to the show. Welcome to SCOTONOMICS. You need to put your mic off. Or back on, I should say.
Hello.
There we go. Yeah, well done. Yeah. I know you're struggling with your voice today, so I'll try and make it easier for you. So I was just saying to William, really topical just now, right now, is the decriminalisation of drugs. This is something I know you feel really passionate about, because you actually brought a resolution to the SNP conference on this. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we go into your article?
Yes, certainly. So in 2016, I believe it was, one of my special topics being someone who was born, raised and lived in Northfield in Aberdeen, which is a very much a recognised area of deprivation within Aberdeen. I've seen a lot of my friends, lose a big part of their life because of drugs and alcohol and substance misuse. So it became one of my special interests, and when I started doing a lot of research into how best to tackle drugs and substance misuse, a lot of the research from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP, which is a fantastic organisation, actually recommended that when you look to decriminalise or legalise and regulate substances, then you're actually getting to the root of the issue, because when you start to produce and package what's now illicit substances up to pharmaceutical standards, they're far more safer to consume, and people actually are at far less risk of losing their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So you must be really pleased with the news just now coming from the Scottish Government. This is something that's, you've been passionate about for a long time, and it's really getting some airing just now. So, but the reason we've got you on the show actually is to talk about an economic article that you wrote for The National. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and what your thinking is as far as how independence could be effective in the northeast of Scotland, which is where we live?
So yeah, a lot of the work I've been doing with Aberdeen's independence movement is about trying to bring the unique northeast perspective and case, and try to get across the message as to how independence would benefit people in the northeast of Scotland. Because as we know, in 2014, we weren't that successful at convincing enough people in the northeast as to why we need independence. And when I talk about the northeast, I mean north of Dundee, of course, the true northeast. So really it was about how, the vast renewable potential the northeast has gone largely untapped through investment from the UK government, who hold the purse strings across the UK and Scotland. We've got a devolved government, the Scottish Government, which is an SNP Green-led government, who are doing everything they can to invest in developing the sector in the northeast by delivering the £500 million Just Transition Fund, for example, to help new industry come into the northeast. But the lack of investment we've seen from the UK government has been pretty atrocious, and I tagged the article, "The UK government has abandoned the northeast," because that's exactly what's happened here. And one of the interesting points I looked and tried to tap into as well during the article is how people in the northeast are actually paying double the amount on the electricity bills that people are in London, where we're actually producing the most renewable energy, which is ridiculous. Whereas in an independent Scotland, we'd be selling our energy, profiting off of it, and actually should be using that to lower our bills. But instead, we're paying twice for it, where we're actually funneling it down to the southeast of England and then paying the highest prices for it as well, which to me, and I know a lot of your viewers as well, doesn't sound right.
Yeah, and I think, we have this in common with, say, Orkney as well, and some of the other islands as well, who are acutely aware that they are creating their own energy, but they're not benefiting financially from it. And one of the big problems, of course, is the transmission charges. So transmission charges above Fife are £7.35 per megawatt hour. Below Fife to the borders, they're £4.70 between Fife and the borders. In England, they're 49 pence. And if you live in the Netherlands or Germany, they don't cost anything. So, this is the cost of the grid is very, very expensive. And we also know that the lack of development in the grid, which has been privatized, has stopped a lot of renewable investment into our area of Scotland as well. That lack of investment from a private company is holding us back too. So, these are things that we can't control, but with independence, we could have much more control of, couldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm all for independence, but there's things that can be happening now that the UK government, because they let's not forget, they do currently have a responsibility of governance of Scotland. While they choose to hold on to Scotland and deny our democracy, they do have a responsibility to invest and govern the country that they're choosing to hold on to. So, like, for example, when the Scottish government demanded or called on them to match the £500 million Just Transition Fund, it was met with silence, pure and utter silence. And they're the people that have the borrowing powers to tap into and put investment into our region, and they've refused to do so.
Yeah. I would. Sorry,
no, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, me and William wouldn't say the borrowing powers. We just say they have the power of money creation. That's what they do, because they are the currency issuer. But William, you go on.
And you're talking about the huge resources, natural resources that are there, and the lack of engagement and the income and the benefit and the profit coming back to the northeast. And what we're doing is we're looking ahead and saying that's likely to happen, because we just need to look back and see what's happened to Aberdeen and the northeast over the last 40 years, when there's been billions and billions of pounds worth of income from our natural resources that have not stayed in that region. And I think that's really clear, and anyone who visits Aberdeen can see that there's huge pockets of wealth and there's huge pockets of poverty. And it's clear that the UK government has not used their power over the last 40 years to make sure that Aberdeen and the northeast saw the benefit of that. And I would just ask anyone who was watching and considering independence as an idea is to just think, where is the evidence that the UK government would do something different with their renewable energy in the northeast? And I think independence gives us an opportunity to prove that we can do something very different. But the evidence is really clear from what's happened in the past.
Yeah, and also just to add into that really quickly as well, I mean, one of the big policy initiatives that the UK have been trying to shout about is their levelling up fund. But it's replacing pennies where pounds used to be when we were part of the European Union, which of course had its issues, but we're far better off. I think we're all feeling the effects of leaving the EU now. But it's just not on. So
yeah, I mean, also as well, I think we've discussed this before, that the Gini coefficient is really bad in Aberdeen. We are one of the most we're the second most unequal place in the UK, along with London as well. So we really have a problem there. But the problems with this in Aberdeen go back some time as well, because so in 1966, the Prices and Income Act hamstrung the traditional industries in Aberdeen and gave the oil jobs an added advantage over them as well. And the increased employment figures led to the loss of development status and regional assistance between 1978 and 1982. And in 1982, the whole of the Northeast was removed from the regional policy assistance. After the oil price slump in 1986, local authorities campaigned unsuccessfully to have assisted area status restored. So what you had was a lot of people making a lot of money in Aberdeen. They would have been paying, that money would have gone to the exchequer, but it wasn't being redistributed in Aberdeen. And in fact, the oil, from what I can see, was a cost. So, for example, a large part of Tory was broken down. For the oil industry, we had to build more schools with the increase of our population. There was a lot of burden on the local authorities to accommodate the oil industry as well. So that was quite costly for the local authorities. And that money wouldn't have been recouped through income tax.
Yeah. And just to add on to that as well, see, one of the examples, the large examples I try and go back to when I'm discussing with organizations or people in the street is I go back to some of the issues we had in Storm Arwen, where we had power cables going out, everything, all the power cables north of Aberdeen are above ground. And when myself and my employer, Colin Adam, MSP, met with some of these organizations saying, listen, we need to put the cables underground, they says, well, there's just not the money for it. So one of the arguments we said was, well, there is money for it because they said it's going to cost billions of pounds. And we went, well, doesn't the Northeast deserve the investment of billions of pounds to put cables underground? Because some of the issues during Storm Arwen, people were left like breathing apparatuses, vital medical equipment, food, water for days on end. And it became a massive well-being crisis. So again, that's investment there that the UK government could help push and invest in the Northeast through, putting cables underground would be job creation for a lot of people. It ties in with the just transition. There's a lot of transferable skills from people in the oil and gas industry who could go into renewables or help push things in that direction as well. So there's a lot of issues.
Yeah, well, absolutely correct. I mean, I should point out as well that during that time, it was the day before my birthday, 2 years ago, that there was a gentleman in a house, and I should point out that Josh works in the Shire, and the Shire was really badly struck by this, and there was an old gentleman who was stuck in his settee overnight because he relied on an electric chair to get him up his stairs, so he had no blanket. These are the kind of things that happen when you're living in more rural areas. That's right. We know from our Nordic neighbours that they don't have to put up with these kinds of things. It's a lack of investment in the Northeast.
Yeah, we've got a technical question, which I'm going to just put up. If either of you know the details of this, I think it's very specific, but I think there's a general point to come from it here. And it's from Graham, who says, why doesn't the Scottish Government tax the heritable assets of the energy companies in Scotland, as they have the power to do so under Section 801 of the Scotland Act, at a figure which would reimburse consumers? Either of you want to make a comment on that?
So, I mean, my initial comment would be, if the Scottish Government makes more money from tax, the block grant will be deducted. So the UK government are always controlling how much currency floats around the Scottish economy. So from that point of view, it's not really going to make much difference to us.
Yeah, that would certainly be my general point. Whether or not that's possible or not, that's very technical. But thanks very much for that question, Josh. It's been really nice to have you on the show. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you soon. And I know you said to me earlier off air that you're going to do a little bit of research on what Aberdeen would be like with a real transitioning away from oil and gas. So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts. After you've done that little bit of research, maybe we'll have you on the show again then. Thanks for your time, Josh. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, well, that was our starter. Now we're on to our main course, which is our interview with Julie. Hello, Julie. How are you doing?
Hi, William. Hi, Karen. Nice to meet you both.
Hi.
Doing fine.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you, and thank you for joining us. Karen, do you want to do a little introduction and we'll get stuck straight into the main part of our show tonight?
Yeah, so Professor Julie Froud is one of the authors of a new book called When Nothing Works, from the cost of living to foundational livability. The book challenges the failed markets, the failed market citizens project of the last 40 years. The project has been led by a political establishment which unanimously agrees on the policy objectives of economic growth and higher paid jobs, but noisily differs on how to get there. So when nothing works, details your solution to change the economic lens by focusing on a 3-pillar framework that will take us beyond what the authors call the UK's policy quagmire. The 3 pillars are essential services, hard and soft social infrastructure, and disposable and residual income. So the book outlines why the idea of a high-wage economy driven by productivity will lead to higher growth that makes us all better off. So welcome to Scotonomics, Professor Froud, and could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, so I work at Manchester University. A long time ago, I was an applied economist and then kind of drifted away from economics and became more interested in studying business models, corporations, financialization, got a little bit fed up with how nothing was changing. And then in the last 10 years, I've been focused on what myself and co-authors call the foundational economy. This is really the nuts and bolts everyday stuff that kind of keeps us safe, keeps us civilized. You know, you get up in the morning, you turn on the tap, you switch on the radio. It's all of the things that you need for civilized life. But increasingly, those things have not been working well. And this book on livability really comes out of that whole stream of work.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we've actually just been talking to our previous guest about Storm Arwen and how that affected the northeast of Scotland and, you know, that fundamental thing of livability. So your book focuses on foundational livability. Would you like to expand on that concept for us?
Yes, of course. So the idea of foundational livability is really giving us a new lens to kind of think about, you know, the way we experience our lives. And it's a way of understanding that we have very different experiences. You know, we could call it quality of life, living standards, livability. You get it much the same thing. But the way we experience that depends very much on the kind of household that we're in, where that household is. And it's a way of kind of broadening out the way we think about a good life. So what we want to do is move beyond simply focusing on income. How much do I earn? How much do you earn? That's our way of kind of accessing a good life. If I have a good job, I can buy what I need. That's the kind of the assumption behind a lot of economic policy. But of course, you know, good life is about more than that. And at one level, it's very common sense, but sometimes the common sense needs to be said, because if you don't get it into the open, in a sense, you can't start to change the way we do policy. So what we try to do is put 2 other things alongside income. The first of those is those essential services. So as you said, the electricity grid, you know, our dependence on clean water, electricity, having access to healthcare and education. Those things are essentials. They're very often not working well. They're not good enough in terms of quality, accessibility. And then the other thing, which is less recognized, but I think it's becoming more of a public issue, and that's the social infrastructure. And again, if you think about what makes a good life, it's our ability to socialize, to learn new skills, to meet people. And that really comes down to having access to social infrastructure. So that could be a nice park that you can visit with your kids, public swimming baths, a library, a community centre, youth clubs, places for older people to meet, younger people to meet, the kind of stuff that, you know, is provided by communities, often with local authority support. But again, courtesy of austerity, a lot of this has disappeared. And, you know, studies show that your access to good social infrastructure is related to, you know, deprivation. So the most deprived places have the worst access to that social infrastructure. So, you know, you can have the income, but if you can't get a GP appointment, if there isn't a park that you can take your kids to, you know, your quality of life gets impacted. So we're really trying to sort of focus on some of the things that matter, but also bring it back to the household, because households exist in real places. and they comprise groups of people, and some households are able to kind of, consolidate their income, share their costs. Some households are doubly disadvantaged. So if you're a single adult household, you're likely to be the most disadvantaged because there's no one that you can share your costs with. So we're really trying to understand all of those things, and then if we can understand how livability is experienced, we can then start to think about what might you do to improve livability, either for particular groups or, for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you make it's a really important point you make, I think, especially now. I mean, we were just, as I was saying, talking to Josh earlier on about the infrastructure issues that we've got with our electricity cables up here in the Northeast. But very much talked about right now on social media is the problems with sewage and water in England at the moment. It's not such a big problem up here. We have a different issue up here, which is our electricity lines being above ground and coming down in these big storms that we're getting now. But for England, it's more that they're not getting clean water, and the water that's going into the rivers and seas is polluting those rivers and seas.
Yes, I think that we've kind of tended to take this stuff for granted, and increasingly, we're having failures of systems, and indeed multiple failures of systems, and we kind of called the book "When Nothing Works." I mean, it's a simplification because, of course, lots of things work well enough. It's not the case that nothing works, but I think it's there's an increasing realization that a lot of things are not delivering the quality and the reliability of service. In some cases, affordability of services. So I'm not sure how it is in Scotland, but in England, it's now impossible to get an NHS dentist. So there's private dentistry, which is fine if you can afford it, but there's a lot of people now, particularly families with children, who can't access dentistry services. And I think it's an accumulation of all of those different things where we think, well, actually lots of things have gone wrong over quite a long period of time, and we need to think about how we are going to address those things. But they have different dynamics, different causes, different situations. Some things are public, some things are private, but it's a case that we need to collectively address those things if we're going to really make a good job of improving livability.
And I thought the book was fantastic. There's so many really good takeaway, from the charts and the graphs, and some of the figures that are in here are shocking when you see them over a long period of time, and I'll cover some of them towards the end of our interview. I just wanted to kind of pull it out a little bit, and we're talking about, I suppose, what gets measured matters. And throughout the book, you're talking about the importance in the UK economy at the moment on GDP, and also on something that you called gross value add. Mm-hmm. I think our audience would be quite well aware of GDP. This is all of the goods that consume the government expenditure, and then kind of divided amongst the number of people in the country to get a figure that they should be earning, but obviously they're not. It's a gross figure. But could you explain what's this concentration on gross value add, and how that has affected the way that the previous few UK administrations have looked at the UK economy?
So gross value added, or GVA, is very similar in effect to GDP. As you can measure the national income in various ways. You can measure it as kind of an all the incomes added together. You can measure it as production. So gross value added is something that tends to get used in regional policy. If you see the Westminster government talking about levelling up, they'll typically talk about GVA and how that's much lower in some regions, some parts of the UK than others. And really, that's a value. That's measuring how much, if you take all of the inputs into production and look at the value of the outputs, it's looking at what's been added. So what's and it's telling you something about the size of the productive base of the economy and how that changes over time. So in practice, the number may be slightly different from GDP, but you're seeing very similar things in terms of the trends. And the critical thing, of course, is that in the UK we're not seeing that growing, and we're seeing very large regional inequalities. So a lot of policies been about how do we close the GVA gap between the more productive regions and the less productive regions, which is how can we make some parts of the UK more functional in economic terms than others. And that's a very old debate, and many people have been trying to close that gap for a long time, not very effectively. I think comes back to the point, Karen, you made earlier about this idea of a policy quagmire. We keep trying to do the same thing and we're not succeeding, and that's why in the book we sort of say, well, let's look at things differently. Let's not assume we can just keep growing the economy and that will solve our problems. It's a bit heretical in some ways, but let's say, well, maybe we can't keep growing, not simply for ecological reasons, but maybe we don't have the policy tools. Maybe our economy is not capable of delivering that growth at the aggregate level.
Yeah. To pick up on one of the points you said there is that you were talking about livability being a really nice, new, clean, bright, big park. Okay, but that wouldn't add anything to GVA or the regional growth GDP by adding this resource, which is clearly of use and to benefit to society. So there, you can see there's a real contradiction, isn't there, when you're talking about the livability and the measurement and the tools that you're using and this kind of traditional GDP gross value added measure. That's kind of at the heart of the lens that you're taking to the economy, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, we're not saying that, income doesn't matter. It would be daft to say it doesn't matter how much income you have as a household or how much income is in your community. Those things matter because we have to buy so much of what we need for our daily life. But one thing we're trying to do in the analysis is say, well, we don't focus on the gross income that you earn from your job or however you get your income, but we want to focus on the idea of residual income. So the income that matters is related to your ability to pay for essential things. So you could think about 4 essential products that every household consumes: housing, food, energy, transport. It's hard to think about any household that doesn't need those. That's not to say there aren't other important essential things that many households need, but if we just simply take those 4, then the idea of residual income is relates the income you have after tax and benefits, which is important for many households. Can you actually afford those 4 things, or is the only way of affording those to in a sense eat up all of your expenditure? Or as we see in the current cost of living crisis, your residual income would actually be negative. If you take a typical household of 2 adults, 2 children in a particular place, we can look at what's the typical expenditure on housing, food, transport, energy, and you can identify which households have a negative residual income. They can't afford all those basic things. And this is a nice way of understanding how it gets worse in general, but also how particular kinds of households get really affected. So we think the focus on residual income is a way of really highlighting the problems that some kinds of households are facing. It's also a way of measuring how things might get better. So if you could use it as a policy tool. You could say, well, if we did certain things, universal free school meals, we have free school meals, but for a very small number of households, it's very hard to get, to be eligible for that. If you did things like that, if you looked at social housing, if you looked at public transport, you could actually do things that made a material difference to the households that are in a most vulnerable situation. So I think it's a way of trying to understand how that experience is felt at the household level, but also to connect it to what could you do to make that household have a higher livability, because a lot of policies are very general, and you kind of the assumption is if we do things, the economy will grow and somehow everybody will end up benefiting in the end.
Yeah, we've been hearing that for 40 odd years, haven't we?
Exactly. I mean, it's very hard to keep listening to that and assuming it's going to work. So we're sort of saying, well, what we're trying to do is identify really particular problems. It might be with the way the universal credit system works, for example, which has real penalties for households in work claiming credit, trying to do the right thing, getting a better job, And in the book we do these calculations, and you can see they're facing a marginal tax rate of 70%. It's the system doesn't work for those kinds of households. So what we're trying to do is kind of pick up both the general arguments, but also think about how different kinds of households experience things very differently.
Yeah. Kieran, have you got a question? I've got a couple of audience which will come in after yours.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you say in the introduction to your book about this blowing, apart perhaps perceptions of right and left wing politics. I would say that traditionally, someone in my age would say, well, left wing politics is really about redistribution, and right wing politics is more about holding things in the hands of a few. That's generally what you're seeing most of the time. Although I think those boundaries are blurring now. I noticed there was a headline the other day about the Labour leader calling people tree huggers, which was quite disparaging. So that was a bit of a surprise. But that really it has to be about redistribution of real resources in a country, and you have a population. And you have to level that out somehow as a government. I think that should be the function of a government. It's just that our governments successively don't seem to have understood that.
Yeah.
Professor Froud, I just wanted to give a quote from the book, just on what Kieran said there, because you said that. You were talking in the book. It was talking about that wealth income is actually twice this. It's twice as bad as wealth inequality is twice as bad as income inequality. And then after that, it said, but othering of high income groups isn't really justified. And then I think you mentioned the 2017 Labour perspective, which was for the many, what the few. And I was kind of looking at that and I was thinking, well, we are talking about redistribution. And when we're talking about redistribution, we can't hide from the fact that we're saying that we have to take stuff from you because you've gained this in a way that's not fair. So maybe othering isn't the proper phrase for that. But surely with this foundational livability, there needs to be a much bigger focus on redistribution.
Yeah, I think there's no two ways around it. If we're not going to grow the economy, which arguably we can't and shouldn't do, then redistribution has to figure much more highly. And I think with the point we were trying to make, and the reason we present kind of income deciles in the book, is we're trying to, in a sense, trying to imagine that there's this kind of group of super rich people who are going to be taxed more highly and will pay for everything doesn't stack up. So I think that's really what our point is. If you there's a very small tail of super rich people, who don't pay much tax and who are accumulating wealth. That's obviously a big issue. But in reality, redistribution has to come from people who are not in the super rich bracket, but in the kind of top 2 or 3 deciles. So the top kind of 10-20% of the population, which is not super rich people. It's to professionals, who own their home. And I think that's what we're trying to sort of, in a sense, look at the realities of what our income distribution is like in the top and the bottom. Not to say the super rich shouldn't pay more, but we all need to pay more. But the other thing about the redistribution, I think, is it's, yes, income redistribution. Yes, it's not simply about the taper rate on universal credit. It's the kind of the abysmal absolute levels of universal credit, which are not enough to live on. There's things we need to do at the bottom end as well. But also the livability idea is that, we need to kind of think about not just the income, but about the services, the social infrastructure, because, if you want to enhance quality of life, the kind of the strength of communities, you've got to redistribute into those other things as well, not simply putting more money into the pockets of lower income households, but improving the social infrastructure, improving the public services. And I think so it's a question of trying to hold all of those things together.
It is very easy to look at this and say we just need to rediscover the best things that we had before this kind of citizenship model that you talk about in the start from the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, this isn't creating something brand new that's never been done before. This is just going back to what we had in the UK. And I actually live in Barcelona, and we have the vast majority of all the things that the UK has lost. and so do a lot of other countries in Europe. So this isn't this kind of wacky radical idea that we,
feels like it, but...
all of a sudden, we suddenly all of a sudden have a nice park and cheap public transport. But moving on to the kind of policy side, we had a question here from Hashtree. How likely is it that either Labour or the Conservatives to make the changes in Westminster suggested by you and your colleagues? And I'd like you to separate that out, because certainly in your book, you mentioned Labour. I think you were talking about Labour as being in some way probably your target market for a lot of things you were covering here. But what do you feel about the kind of current administration or a future Conservative administration compared to a Labour administration? Because I've got to be honest, in Scotland, we don't really see much of a difference between those two administrations at all. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a really depressing prospect at the moment. I mean, when we submitted the book manuscript in January, so we were kind of writing it in the last year, and at that time we could see this increasing kind of convergence of kind of thought around economic policy, and it's only got worse in the last few months. And those who might be looking for a more progressive, a more traditional social democratic government, I think are struggling a little bit at the moment to see much sign of difference. I mean, there's clearly still a very strong free market fringe to the Conservative Party. That could gain more power within, if we had a future Conservative government. You can't rule anything out. There's a danger that things could get worse. But I think the chances of things getting better with an election, I think, look quite small at the moment, because, we're being promised fastest growth in the G7, but I don't think many of us would feel confident that that's going to happen. And the idea seems to be, well, we get high growth, and then we can pay for the public services and the good stuff, and we'll all be long gone by then.
It's incredibly familiar again.
Yeah. So I think that if we're looking to Westminster government, I don't see we might be pleasantly surprised, but I think one of the arguments we try to make in the book is that we shouldn't assume that a new government in Westminster is necessarily going to bring a whole different way of thinking. You can see different ways of thinking in the devolved administrations, in some of the city regions, in some local authorities. You can see it at the community level, people where there's much less resource, there's less autonomy, but you can see all kinds of imaginative things happening. But that needs to be sort of turbocharged via Westminster, because our sort of our form of government with the concentration of power and resources means that the most enlightened local authorities, social enterprises, devolved authorities can do relatively little.
Yeah. Yeah, well, certainly, because that's interesting to hear, because when I was reading through the book, there was certainly nothing around Scottish devolution, and there wasn't much around an extension of Welsh self-governance as well. And with their particular political framing, I thought like you'd missed certainly an element here of saying that actually a way for a nation like Scotland or for Wales to advance their foundational livability was by having and being able to elect a much more progressive party. And in Scotland, we have, certainly a party that's more on the left than the UK Labour, and Wales do as well, and with the Welsh Labour Party. Was there any reason you shied away from that in terms of the devolved settlement?
I think it's because what we were trying to do in the book is to say, look, lots of people have written about the need for transformation, the need for kind of, new paradigms, whatever, and wouldn't disagree with that. But our sense was we need to get on with stuff now. And the book talks about Wales because myself and my co-authors, we've done quite a lot of work in Wales, so we're much more familiar with that. In Wales is a lot further away from independence than Scotland, for example. Wales, the devolved government in Wales has fewer powers than the Scottish one does. There's no sign that either of them, the UK political parties, is going to hand over significantly more power and resources. So I think what we were trying to do is to avoid sort of saying, let's first assume we've got, stronger devolved government. Let's first assume we can get that, and then we can do something. I don't want to say is what can we start doing now
Yeah.
Because if we wait, things just get worse and worse. So it's not to say that, more power and resources for devolved authorities in the English regions, even more so than in Scotland and Wales. I live in Greater Manchester and population of 3 million. It's more or less the same size as Wales, but it has even less autonomy and financial resources than Wales, and far less than Scotland. So in a sense, it's about twin tracking, I guess. Yes, those things are important, but we also need to kind of move a lot faster, and also demonstrate how to do things. I think there's a big problem in the UK. There's a lot of distributed intelligence, there's a lot of really interesting experiment social innovation going on, but very limited learning and sharing. And I think that's a real priority, is how do we get more stuff happening? How do we get it done more quickly? Because we're just in a massive crisis of so many different things.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see your pain, and it comes through in the book. I think you've done a huge amount of diagnosis on what the problems are, and I really felt like when I was getting towards the end of the book that I was going to come across some really radical suggestions, and I think from a pragmatic perspective, I think you and the researchers have said, well, we've absolutely no chance of anything radical. Where are the small wins? And I think you've got three things that kind of like stealth, stretch. I think one of them's another S in there. And it was that. And my big question for you, and Professor, is, do you think that you're able to change a system which is clearly broken? And in the book, you say that these three pillars have been decimated. Are you really able to change a system without really deep and meaningful systemic change? Because one of the ways that we see that for Scotland is independence. We can't see another way of breaking this system down so that we're able to try and build it up and repair it. What can the rest of the United Kingdom do to kind of move the government away from this high wage, we'll just be more productive, we'll just grow, but with everything else seemingly not to work? If it's not independence, tell us, what is it? What can we do to expect a better future for them all?
I think that's the difficult thing, is that we shouldn't let go of the big things. They should be they should be motivating us. They should give us a sense of direction. But I think we also need to be doing a lot of other things on the journey, and through doing that, we're going to be learning a lot more about how to do things, particularly how to use resources that we have, in different kinds of ways. I mean, I have a horror when I hear about things like, reform of the health service or reform of public service, because you just know this is going to be another kind of, hugely time-consuming, distracting mess. But if you get below that, it's possible to think about, and this is happening in places, how do we redesign the delivery of services centered around people? How do you join those things up? How do you think about more preventative social services? And those things are happening in pockets. People do know how to do those things. How do we liberate that knowledge? And so I'd say don't let go of the big things, don't let go of the ambition, but we can't wait. So how do we get on with things? So that was the idea of our kind of, well, let's have some starter policies. I mean, Wales is in, universal free school meals for primary school kids. I mean, it's such a big thing. I mean, it shouldn't be such a big thing. We shouldn't be having to make that step up. And in England, no chance of getting even those morsels. Social housing, again, something we used to do well. But there are groups, there are actors, progressive housing associations, some local authorities who are able to do things, and we should be kind of empowering them to get on. And then, I mean, theories of change do suggest that the ability to demonstrate things can be very powerful. If you want to get leaders to change, simply telling them things, expecting them to be rational, is pretty hopeless. But if you can show them to something, you can take them to somewhere, if you take people to Barcelona, you can show them kind of all manner of innovative things, and they can see it's possible. Even more effective, you take people to Scotland or Wales or the north of England and show them a redesigned service that works. That might be a way of getting some of that bigger structural change. So the book's incredibly depressing at one level, but we're trying to be sort of both hopeful and pragmatic on the basis that if we calling for big systemic change, we can't realistically think we're going to get that now, but we think there are things that can be done, and we think there are people that can do things, and by doing more, then maybe that's our best hope.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because I agree. I read the book over a week, and I did find it fascinating, and I pulled out another phrase here, because it says faster growth is not just an unrealizable false hope, but an ecologically irresponsible and misconceived idea. And that came across really strongly in the book. And then I was thinking, how do you move from that and that awareness and that understanding to saying things like, we can gradually move this system with these policies and there's no radical changes possible? And I'm just wondering how you kind of marry that, because it's almost like you were aware of the huge problems, but there wasn't a really clear big system change that could come out of it. How did you marry that in the book when you were writing it?
Well, I guess we are envisaging a big change, but the big change is not one system. It's like trying to think about livability as a much more kind of holistic thing that can be addressed in very many different ways by different people. So I think that, we know that, most mainstream politicians are not paying enough attention to nature and climate emergency, that everything is moving way too slowly. But equally, talking about degrowth is politically, I think, quite difficult. Whereas, we're trying, if we can reframe things around livability, which kind of works with a kind of planetary limits, then this is maybe a language that can find some traction. So I think in a sense, I mean, it is radical at one level, but maybe we're trying not to be too scary.
We've got a really good question from one of our patrons, which is on that, because thanks for that answer. And this is from Rosaline O'Connor. She said, how can you explain this idea of foundational livability to the general public in terms that they will understand and get on board and get excited about?
Well, I think in a way it makes sense. I mean, our interest in social infrastructure comes out of doing research in communities, and it's what people have told us. So you go somewhere and you talk to people about what's it like to live here, what's important to you, what would you like to see, and people say, oh, the park is rubbish, the high street's horrible, they've closed the youth club. And in a sense, people understand that. People like what they want to live where they live, they like the people in their community, but they are struggling with the bus service, they're struggling with a park that's not been maintained. So anyway, I don't think it's hard for people to understand livability is, a clumsy word, of course, but I think breaking it down into saying, well, what matters is, can you and your household, can you afford the essentials? Is there some money left? Might you be able to save a little bit? Can you afford, to do a few nice things every now and again? Do you have access to good public services? Can you, is there a bus service that can take you where you need to go? Do you have the facilities locally, parks, the swimming baths? I think it's, it is very immediate for people. So I think it does have, I don't think it's a way of kind of trying to make the economy in a way very accessible in terms of people's experiences. So as an academic, perhaps I'm not the most effective at turning things into an everyday language, but I think the concepts themselves are not difficult.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good answer, because I do think when you get personal and you talk about things that are important to people, as you've done in it comes across really strongly in the book, a lot of people will talk about the sense of place and that they don't want to move, and you can get $5,000 paid more living over here. It doesn't matter. I want to stay here. And the sense of place is really profound. And I think we forget, that, especially someone like myself and Kieran, who both moved around. There's a huge percentage of the population who are so connected to that. I did want to finish on a point that you would probably expect two people who are deeply influenced by MMT to discuss. And within the book, I really felt that you'd kind of hemmed yourself into the possible solutions by talking about the government as a currency user rather than a currency issuer. And you were saying that, you know, the government couldn't, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you said the government cannot afford. I think you were saying there's financial constraints, which we would argue, Kieran and I would argue against. But I really feel that if you're going to people and saying to them, what's wrong with your park and we need to spend more money, but at the same time says, but the government has got to be really, really careful of what it because it can only spend money from taxes, or it can only borrow to spend. Do you not think with that approach, you're kind of hemming yourself into a much smaller group of possibilities or outcomes for an economy?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not an expert on MMT, so it's an interesting question. I guess the way we were trying to frame it is to say, well, this is the kind of this is the environment in which we sort of see as being quite settled. I don't see, you know, there's a lot of high profile advocates for MMT, but I don't immediately see that loosening is monetary loosening is going to happen, because the current policy rhetoric is around fiscal responsibility. So yes, you know, in a sense, in a different situation, you could envisage having a lot more cash. I mean, I think, you know, we need more taxes, we need wealth taxes, we need to find financial resources for the you know, the good stuff. But I guess I'm not
MMT, you don't need to find any financial resources because you have a government which creates financial resources. Taxes are great for, you know, affecting inequality and for controlling inflation and for, you know, for various others. But taxes don't pay for government spending. Government spending is money that's created. And again, I think this really weakens the overall argument when, you know, even if it's not a solution, but at least saying to people that these are policy choices. The government is deciding not to spend money. It's not constrained financially. And I think that's a really important point, which I said, obviously it's MMT, as we were just a little bit disappointed that the book wasn't clear that the UK government is a currency issuer to create all of this, and that taxes and bonds and borrowing does not pay for government spending.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I guess what we're trying to do in the book is move away from a kind of macro thing, because we've done a lot of work on financialization for a long time, and there's really little of that, and there's not much discussion of neoliberalism and all of that big picture stuff in the book, because in a way, in the limited number of words we had, we just wanted to kind of do something a little bit different. But yes, I mean, obviously, you know, that you could take that livability framework and put it in a different macro context, you know, and the priorities are still there, but you would have a different way of thinking about what are the resources that you might have access to. So yeah, thanks for the comment. Appreciate it.
Okay. I've probably got about 20 or 30 books, Professor, that I know I will go to every couple of weeks. And this is one of them, because I think the huge amount of research that you've done on household income and breaking it down, and some of the kind of stories and the impact that, you know, the inability to own a car has for a huge percentage of the people in UK. And again, I feel very privileged living in a European city with fantastic public transport. I mean, you know, we're a little bit bigger than Manchester, but we have the public transport that London has. And I look across the UK and think that this is what everyone should have. And I don't necessarily think that the UK would be more productive, but people would be much happier if they had these services, which do make your life so much better in terms of livability. So I really do encourage people to get this. We'll bring out lots of the stats from the charts and the research that you did. I thought it was really interesting. My final question was the one I put to you on email, because we're actually writing an article in the Scottish National tomorrow, which talks about these economic frameworks and where they would go. We've got two paradigms. We've got a kind of growth paradigm, which is the where we are now, and then we've got what I've kind of called a steady state paradigm. How do things work when we're really aware that we can't extend any further into our planetary boundaries, and we have to live in kind of, you know, live much more within our means. And I put your framework within the growth framework. Where would you place that? You know, those kind of, you know, really two stark choices.
Well, I guess that, you know, we're hostile to growth, for the pragmatic reason we just don't see it happening in the UK. I mean, other economies have more ways of growing, but in the UK, if you look at the trends in growth in the last 40 years, I mean, you know, I find it very hard to imagine how we are going to return to that. So I think we're hostile to growth, as a kind of fantasy of policy, you know, the idea that it's going to rescue us. But I think also hostile to growth from the point of view that it's not possible for us to grow and, you know, address the nature and climate emergencies. So I think, you know, I wouldn't put us in the growth box. I think what we're trying to do is actually say something quite heretical about, in some ways, about growth. Not simply that it's a bad thing, but actually we you know, it's not a possible thing. So it's, and I guess what we're trying to do is think about a language around livability, which is a way of thinking about how do you reframe people's lives in ways that can be consistent with, you know, reducing emissions, you know, public transport, you know, all of those things, but in a way that maybe is more appealing and intuitive to people. Because I think, you know, the kind of steady state degrowth kinds of arguments, I think, are happening in very remote places, and I think they're not, I think, cutting through to, you know, to larger numbers of people. So I think how do you present those ideas in ways that make people think, well, actually, in doing this, maybe I'm going to have a better quality of life. You know, it may imply some very different things about working time, and, you know, we didn't discuss time in the book. It's something that, you know, we want to do more work on, because in a sense it's not simply about money, it's about time in livability, and the redistribution of work is going to be a really big issue, I think. You know, so how do we not only redistribute income, but how do we redistribute work and time, because those are key ingredients for livability.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. I did want to finish just with that chart, because you mentioned that there, you've got the UK's year-on-year growth rate of real GDP. And again, we've spoke about the issues with GDP, but it is seen as a way that the economy is growing. But you've just got this slowly declining line from the 1980s right to where we are now. And if you were in any other sector or business or industry, or, you know, if you were looking at your football team and they were in the 4th division and had been sliding for 40 years, there's no way that you would say, just keep doing what you've been doing, but just a little bit harder, and you're suddenly going to get this massive shift. And that's what's so clear. If growth is, and you know, it's not, but if growth is measured as being a proxy for well-being by the state, it's clear that the route that they're going right now is not going to do that. And if we look at a well-being perspective rather than GDP, you can't see anywhere where this kind of current paradigm is going to lead to a really different position for our economy. And I think that's why, after reading the book, I was thinking, you haven't suggested that we need a whole-scale systemic change, which I think you need to move out of the growth paradigm. So I completely, off my own bat, dropped you into that growth into that growth paradigm. But I think you've put so much effort into the book and explaining that that's probably a little bit unfair. I might quickly see if I can make that amend. I want to have a chat to Kieran. It was fantastic. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. My final question for you was that if you look at the UK, do things work slightly better in Scotland than they do in our UK?
Well, that's maybe people living in Scotland might have a better view about that. I think yes and no. I mean, obviously things have been less messed up in Scotland. You know, mentioned, you know, water earlier. Well, you know, in the sense that, you know, Scottish water is in a less dire state than the English water companies. I think social democratic values are more accepted in you know, front bench politics. I think, you know, that, you know, you kind of held on to that, you know, same in Wales as well. I think Welsh Labour still retains, you know, strong socially democratic values, and I think certainly I see in Wales a lot more kind of sense of hope and possibility. And I think as an outsider, I sense that in Scotland, again, there's more sense that we can do things it's possible to do things. Whereas I think you shouldn't underestimate in England that sense of possibility and hope, which is a real fundamental, I think is really, really, really damaged. Not that there aren't good things happening, but I think, you know, I think those are prerequisites for, you know, innovators, social entrepreneurs, pioneers, you know, radical thinkers. You've got to be able to think that it's possible to do things. But I think one thing I see in Wales, and I suspect in Scotland too, is a bit of a gap between kind of progressive narratives and progressive actions. I think that both Welsh and Scottish governments are very good at the grand strategic stuff and saying the right thing. I think there's a gap in terms of how actually delivering on some of that, and I think some of that's becoming clearer now, you know, in the gap since devolution, that, you know, in the sense it all sounds nicer, but, you know, maybe not, you know, things are not being done quite as well as we hoped. And of course, in both Wales and Scotland, you still see very strong degrees of centralisation. So you have some mimicking of the Westminster UK issue in the devolved regions. You see Greater Manchester too. In any devolved region, you have this problem about, you know, core and, you know, centre and outside areas. So I think, you know, lots of signs of hope in Scotland, but also I think lots of reasons not to be complacent about, you know, how much more needs to be done.
I would certainly agree with that. Professor Froud, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting and a really thoughtful session, and I do recommend people head out and buy the book. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting, and I do encourage people to, if they're not able to purchase the book, there's a wonderful PDF which Julie and her team wrote. I think it was about 2018, which you can download, which kind of outlines the idea of foundational livability. And we did have a few questions, which I didn't really have time to drop in. We've got one here from Hashbury. Is growth inevitable with multinational corporations exploiting population growth? I think we really need to talk about agency, and there's a huge amount of agency within corporations, but there's also a massive amount of agency within governments. And if governments do want to restrict the actions of businesses, they have much more power than they tend to realise. And certainly use. So thanks for that question. We've got a question
Can
from...
I just also add to that? I think also in response to what Hashbury is saying, that the polity have agency. What I've found as a politician and as a campaigner before that is that an awful lot of people are not aware of their agency. And if we could make people more aware of their political agency and their economic agency, we could make massive change. I think anyone who understands that really has to be busy doing something about that.
Yeah, well, I think there's only so much that we can do, and I think the agency really sits effectively with outside the polity and in the organisation. So you and I can discuss that in detail, Karen. Okay, we've got one from Charles. If the current economy is being mismanaged and national income depleted, how are local developments to be funded? Karen, do you want to kind of take that as a practical question to you in terms of local development in Aberdeen? If something wants to be done in Aberdeen, how does that happen? Where does the money come from?
Okay, so for the council, the money comes from various pots, lots of different pots actually. So some of it from the Scottish government and some of it directly from the Treasury. It's called the Public Works Board. And our officers apply for funding from there. There are also pots of money that come for both governments for specific things. For example, just transition money. You can apply for that as long as what you're applying for is within the boundaries of what they want to achieve with that money. So, there are multiple pots of money that you go after. And then, of course, we have things like if you drive in a bus gate, you will pay money, you'll pay parking charges, council tax. That makes up about 25% of our income, and also with money from the housing that we have. We still have a lot of council housing, 22,000 council houses in Aberdeen, which are run by the council. They haven't been given over to housing associations. So there's lots of different monies coming into the council. How can they be managed better? I think a really big example for this, really obviously to me, is that we have 2 large shopping centres in Aberdeen, and both of them are using tax havens. So money from the shoppers goes to pay the rent of there, and the money disappears out of Aberdeen, out of Scotland, out of the UK, never to return. That's not a good situation.
Yeah. And that's an example of that kind of multiplier factor. If that money stays in Aberdeen, it's spent somewhere else. It regenerates an area. It's income tax for the government. All these things, but when it's disappearing. Charles, I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure if it was exactly where you were going with that. I just had to make a little bit of a guess on that. But certainly, if the economy's been better managed, then the government is more able to release the resources in the economy that it wants to, and that's really the constraint rather than that kind of financial constraint. But certainly,
can I just add to that as well? So, for example, on the money that we get from the Public Works Board, we pay interest on it. So instead of paying interest on perhaps things that maybe the UK government see as perhaps superfluous to absolute need for a council, and more to, what, instead of charging us interest, which comes from the income of people in Aberdeen, why don't you just tax those people who are offshoring money? So that would be good.
Okay, yeah, I like that. Okay, I'll see if there's anything else. We had a question or comment here about the working week, I think. I'll see if I can quickly pull that one across. Graham, I think it may have just been a comment. Some countries are reducing the working work week without reductions in salaries. We reduced the working week 35 to 25 hours with no loss of salary, so not all employees are the same. This is the professor and our team did cover a lot on productivity in the book, and it was one of the most fascinating areas that I found was this. We always it's a default position for the Scottish government as much as the UK government is to say that people have to be much more productive, and then we'll all be much better off. And I think it's G.K. Galbraith talks about productivity, and he says that the government only want you to be productive in your working life. The 8 hours that you do at work, they don't care if you're productive in the other 16 hours that you've got. So I think productivity is an interesting kind of shorthand for government to say increase productivity and we all become much better off. But actually, there's an argument that, especially in a service-dominated industry, that productivity, if we would have had the productivity gains, we would have probably had them by now. And I certainly think this idea of reducing the working week and actually productivity maybe going down a little bit isn't that bad an idea. What a lot of people will say is we gave people more time off and productivity didn't drop. Well, again, I think we've set our bar really, really low, and we should be saying, well, we expect productivity at work to reduce, but we want people's overall productivity in terms of their well-being and their happiness to rise. So again, I think it comes back to that kind of lens that the professor spoke about that we are putting on our economy. If it's very much through this market, this individual citizenship approach, we look at things like productivity and growth very, very differently. And we've got an eye exactly there from Chris. So thanks so much. I know there's a wonderful show on right now. It's the I Matter show. I'm sorry we ran on a little bit, but we did have 2 guests for you this evening. Thanks so much for joining us. In 2 weeks' time, we've got another session we're going to have that's right bang up today, and it's talking about what's causing inflation right now, and that's with the economist Dirk Ince. So we're going to get right into what's causing inflation right now, and also what are governments and central banks trying to do to stop inflation, and are they doing the right or the wrong thing. So we'll be back in a couple of weeks' time, and we look forward to seeing you then. So bye everyone from Barcelona, and Kieran.
And bye-bye from Aberdeen.
Thanks everyone. See you in a couple of weeks. Bye for now.